Star Wars Battlefront 3 is a video game that in many of our minds is a game like no other. It's obviously not out and it's probably not going to come out for a very long time, but I can imagine we all envision Battlefront 3 to be the ultimate Star Wars experience that encapsulates the entire franchise, spanning from the High Republic era through to the Rise of Skywalker and soon to be beyond. Now that is naturally a very big task for anyone, even the likes of DICE who have now had plenty of experience with the Battlefront series, and obviously the reason for that is because the Star Wars franchise is absolutely massive. If you take a look at where Star Wars was prior to the end of Battlefront 2, we had just had the first season of The Mandalorian, but then before that we had things like Star Wars Resistance, Rebels, Clone Wars, and then 8 films because The Last Jedi was about to release, Solo was about 6 months away from releasing, and then The Rise of Skywalker was 2 years away from releasing. So obviously the franchise was still very big at that point, and there was loads of content that they could have added to the game based on that stuff, especially the Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels. But if you look at the franchise now, you've got the High Republic, which is a massive era in itself, but then you also now have things like the Bad Batch, Kenobi, Andor, The Mandalorian, the Book of Boba Fett, and Ahsoka is just about to release as well, and so much more on the way. And I think that is ultimately the problems that developers will now face when looking to make a Battlefront game, if anyone does. Because the problem really is if you want to include absolutely everything, or at least all 3 of the main eras to start with, even then you'll still be spread so thin because of all of the new content that I've just gone over. But then if you also incorporate the High Republic, all of the Clone Wars stuff, the Bad Batch, and like I said, everything else that's new, I just feel like for a launchable game that's in a good state, you really won't be able to get a huge amount out of it, and it would just be a real shame. Back when Battlefront 2 was still around, it was a little bit simpler at that point because you could just make content based off of the 9 main saga films, and then after that you could look into the likes of Rogue One, Solo, Clone Wars, and Rebels, and even touched a little bit on Resistance as well for the sequel trilogy, but at the time that's pretty much all there was. But now though, where do you even start? You could of course go on to make the maps for the same planets of the 9 main films for the 100th time in Battlefront games. Apart from the sequels, of course, they only really have like that one version because the sequels are pretty new in comparison. But we've still seen these 9 episodic mainline films so much that I feel like making a Battlefront 3 now, people might just get a little bit bored of playing on the same planets, but of course I could be wrong. And I think the important thing really would just be to make maps that are completely different to what we've had before. So if that was the case, I don't think it would be too bad. I personally think that you would just be better off making a game focusing on the content that wasn't in Battlefront 2, so you could have a focus more on the Clone Wars TV series, Star Wars Rebels, Resistance, and the actual Mando saga itself, as well as Andor and Kenobi and all the rest of it. Now the reason I think that would be better is because at least at that point pretty much everything will be new to even long-time fans of the Battlefront series, so I just think there would be more excitement there, instead of playing Endor for the 50th time in the last few games. Obviously that is an exaggeration, but we have obviously had Endor an awful lot, so something very new would be very welcome. Now whilst I think that's one way you could do a Battlefront 3 where you focus everything in one game, I actually think there's probably a better way to do it, in that for the future of the Battlefront series you don't actually make Battlefront 3, you just make several different Battlefront games that actually focus on a specific era or even a series or a group of series like the Mando saga, for example. Looking at the Mando saga or the Mandoverse, whatever you want to call it, if they did a Battlefront game for that, you would have 2 main factions, and they would obviously be the New Republic and the Imperial Remnant. So you'd then be playing as Remnant Stormtroopers and New Republic officers, which I think straight away would be pretty cool because that's not really something we've actually seen in this era before. But then you could have heroes inspired by the TV shows we've had so far, so we could have Din Djarin, Ahsoka, Bo-Katan and more. And then for the villains it would be the same with Moff Gideon, Baylan Skoll and Thrawn and all the rest of them. And then as for the maps, they will obviously also be inspired by the series that span this time period, so you could have a few iterations of Navarro because obviously since season 1 it's changed a lot, but then you could also have the likes of Lothal and Mandalore. I think especially once it gets to the point where Dave Filoni's film comes out and the Mandoverse is essentially finished, I genuinely think you could make a Battlefront game big enough, like Battlefront 2 but based off of this series alone, and I think that's actually quite an exciting prospect. Because of that, it would allow game developers to actually focus on this time period and be able to make a really detailed experience in this setting, which I feel like you probably wouldn't be able to get done in something like Battlefront 3. Obviously you still could do that, that, but I just think having a more focused experience would make for a more engaging narrative. And obviously the TV shows themselves have been a huge success so far, so if there was a game inspired by all of these TV shows, I think that would be incredibly successful as well. Now that's just one example, because you could do the exact same thing for the Star Wars Rebels era, where you have things like Star Wars Rebels, Andor, potentially even Kenobi and Fallen Order. Just pretty much anything that takes place prior to episode 4 and after episode 3 I think would actually be really interesting. So you could even add some content from the Bad Batch. And that right there means that there's going to be tons and tons of content to add to a Battlefront game of that type. And of course you could then also look at the Clone Wars, which obviously did get quite a bit of content in Battlefront 2 during its lifespan, but there's still so much, especially with regards to maps, that they could go and add in a Clone Wars specific Battlefront game. So I honestly think that is the way I would like to see things go. Now of course these games wouldn't have to be the Battlefront in name, but I imagine they probably would play like that a little bit. Even if it wasn't a Battlefront game, I would just absolutely love to see a multiplayer Star Wars game that focuses on a few of the TV shows in a lot of detail, a bit like what Battlefront 2 did for us back in the day. But that is ultimately just what I think, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about this idea as well for the future of the Battlefront series. So if we do get future Battlefront games, do you think it should involve absolutely everything in one ultimate package like Battlefront 3, or do you think we should actually have multiple games like I suggested that all cover a wider scope in a very specific area of Star Wars? Let me know what you think in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more Star Wars gaming content. That is it from me today though. Thank you all very much for watching, and may the force be with you always.